AMD's return to form with 2017's Ryzen series marked a seismic shift in the CPU landscape, but from a pure gaming perspective, the first few generations of Zen were merely good for the price. The IPC gap between Intel and AMD would shrink steadily over the next few years, but it was still always there. Zen 3 finally closed that gap, and for a hot minute the Ryzen 5 5600X was one of the best gaming CPUs in the world. The Ryzen 5 5600X released in late 2020 at the beginning of the scalper pandemic. Although that period in recent history will always be known for the shortage of graphics cards and consoles, in the early days it affected everything, including CPUs. I was lucky enough to grab my 5600X from retail shortly after it hit shelves, for the not inconsiderable retail price of £300. For that hefty chunk of money, I received a 6-core 12-thread CPU built on a single CCX using AMD's 7nm process, with class-leading instructions per clock at the time, as well as a massive 32MB Level 3 cache. In 2023, almost 3 years after its release, those specs don't look quite so impressive anymore, with the new Ryzen 7000 series built on 5nm and the X3D models offering a massive 128MB of 3D V-cache. But now that the 5600X's new price has dropped to £150 and used prices are around £125, this might still be worth picking up. Channel regulars will know that the 5600X is the heart of my moderately priced gaming PC, with which I do all my older and budget GPU tests. It's also been the reference point on my CPU test chart for the last few months, and that's why I'm making this dedicated video. The original test results were at stock settings with PBO enabled, with clocks varying in-game between 3.6 and 4.6 GHz, leaving some of my tests a little too close to being GPU bound. For a more consistent set of results, I'm running the 5600X manually overclocked to 4.7 GHz at 1.28 volts. This would turn out to be completely sufficient for every test, except the Cinebench run, which crashed every single time. So for that benchmark, I ended up clamping on a 240mm AIO and turning the voltage up to 1.39. For RAM, I'm using 4 8GB sticks of DDR4, clocked at 3600 CL16. My GPU, as usual, is the Gigabyte RTX 3070, because I can't afford anything better. F's in the comments. I don't think people can actually differentiate between a game running at over 400 FPS and one running at over 200. However, games like Valorant serve as a handy way of comparing CPUs and charting development over time. It's not uncommon for even old processors to be able to keep up with high refresh rates in this title, but naturally modern CPUs have a significant edge. The Ryzen 5600X in my original test last year managed an impressive 400 plus FPS, but that wasn't even close to my latest overclock results, so I took the opportunity to go back and retest the stock results as well. This time with PBO enabled, I was seeing results of 540 FPS averaged across 3 matches. At 4.7 GHz, this goes up to over 550. An admittedly barely perceptible difference, but the 1% and 0.1% were a great deal higher with the OC. Again, this is, in my opinion, a functionally useless flex over even a decade-old i5, but it still sounds very impressive. I had something of an oops moment in Battlefield 5. After completing a few matches across different maps, I looked at my capture footage only to see that I'd messed up. At some point, the 200 FPS cap had reinstated itself, causing some less demanding maps to be skewed. After removing the cap once more, I went back and benchmarked everything a second time. However, my capture footage is from that first set of results. With the cap removed, the PBO-enabled 5600X saw an average of 191 FPS across 3 games. The overclocked results saw that average climb to 193. Hardly worth the effort, really. Even 1% and 0.1% lows were within margin of error, so if you can't overclock your 5600X, I wouldn't worry too much about it in this title. Returning to absurdly high numbers that do nothing but act as a measuring stick for CPUs and as bragging rights to their owners, Fortnite in performance mode offers staggeringly high frames. The overclock brings the average up from 395 to 438, about a 10% improvement. Alas, Fortnite still suffers from poor frame time pacing, so the 1% and especially the 0.1% lows are annoyingly low. But the overall experience was still extremely good, and locking to a lower frame rate would no doubt give a very smooth experience. On the other hand, not every game sees a demonstrable improvement this time around. In fact, in the strictest sense, this overclocked run of Flight Simulator is actually a little lower than the results from stock speeds. Half a frame difference on average isn't really a big reduction, but it's not an improvement either. I'm learning not to take this sim at face value though, especially after seeing how the ground detail scaling kicks in on weaker processors. As usual, Spider-Man Remastered gets 2 runs, one at 1440 very high, with DLSS quality and no ray tracing, and 1 run at the same settings with RT enabled. The former is very much CPU limited, and there's only a few frames difference between the two 5600X runs. I refreshed my PBO results and saw 137 FPS on average, with occasional dips into the 70s. The overclock result only added a couple of frames across the board, with slightly worse 0.1s for some reason. With RT enabled, the added GPU load is obviously something of a bottleneck, but there's still a small difference in CPU performance. Without the overclock, the game averages 86 FPS, with lows dipping a little below 60. Pushing up to 4.7 GHz adds 4 FPS, more than the RT run, but still a sub 5% difference that people aren't realistically going to notice. Since apparently I test faster CPUs now, I've given Cyberpunk 2077 an extra run this time around. At 1440 Ultra with DLSS quality, the 5600X overclock result hovers around the 75 FPS mark, within margin of error from the previous run, and practically tied with the i7 5960X. Meanwhile, at 1440 RT Ultra with DLSS balanced, the ray-traced result falls just short of 60 FPS. Again, functionally equal to the old 8-core. To be 100% certain that the GPU wasn't holding things back, I did a third run at 1440 medium with DLSS balanced, which brings the overclocked 5600X to within spitting distance of 100 FPS. This is only a roughly 5% improvement over stock, which is probably within the margin of error, but it's a symbolic victory. Red Dead Redemption 2 seems to be GPU limited too, but it feels like I'd have to drop quality way further than usual, or use a much more powerful graphics card to get past that. My usual test setup for this title is 1440 with the slider nudged over to favour quality and DLSS Q to drop the render resolution to 960p. In both the old and new runs, this saw an average of about 85 FPS, with the stock settings actually achieving a much better 1% and 0.1% score. Now, while those lower 1% might not make much sense, it definitely sounds like a GPU limit. Well, I tried a second run with DLSS turned all the way down to performance, dropping the render resolution from 960p to 720p, and that considerable drop in render resolution saw an improvement of only 10%, with GPU utilization still in the high 90s and the CPU in the low 60s. The newly updated Witcher 3 clearly likes the Zen 3 chips more than its predecessors, or any of the other older chips I've tested so far. It also seems to favour higher clock speeds, as at 1440 Ultra with DLSS balanced, the overclocked result is almost 10% higher than the stock settings. Averages come in at just under 90 FPS, with 1% lows passing 60 for the first time. Finally, you thought things couldn't get any more exciting in the battle for Civ 6 supremacy, but the Ryzen 5 5600X had to reclaim its crown from the lowly pretender, the Ryzen 7 4700G. The overclocked result sees average turn times drop by a whopping 0.19 seconds, firmly establishing Zen 3's dominance over the older chips. And there we have it. Still, in my opinion, one of the best value CPUs AMD has ever released, and one which I think will still have a place in gaming for a while to come, especially as prices drop. Right now, the non-X version seems to be the better buy, especially given how relatively irrelevant overclocking appears to be. 4.7 GHz and possibly even higher clocks do seem to be achievable, but the necessary added voltage generates a ton of heat, and adding an extra £30 or so to upgrade your cooler to a dual tower or a big cumbersome AIO is, in my opinion, unrealistic. You can still get performance out of this £150 chip that puts old flagships to shame without going overboard on overclocking. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.